this year we have a phenomenal opportunity to continue to revisit the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and what his life has meant. And so at UND, we are really fortunate to have Dr. Yohuru Williams being able to share some insights and thoughts about Dr. King's work. And so I want to say thank you so much for spending time and being with us here today.
Great. It's great to be here, and I'm excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to start us off. So our theme for this year's Dr. Martin Luther King celebration is really focusing on his speech, Rediscovering Lost Values. And for us, we've thought about that, and we thought this would be a good theme for us this year, really thinking about Dr. King's work then and now. And so I really want to start on that vein in terms of thinking about his speech. One of the things that Dr. King talked about was this notion of having moral values. He said we need to rediscover our moral values. And so I'm wondering, as we think about this notion of lost values, how can we apply his belief of moral values to today?
It's a great question because the great James Baldwin was famous for saying the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. What Dr. King was really calling us to do in that speech was to think about those things that are supposed to anchor us, the things that we profess, and whether we live up to them in reality. So it's easy to profess a respect for freedom of speech. It's easy to profess a respect for diversity. But what are the things that you're actively doing to promote that in the areas that you have influence and control? And whether that be in institutions or even in your home, what practice do you make of privileging that in ways that are meaningful, that create that kind of meaningful engagement? Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's critical to think about kind of three elements of that speech in that regard. Rediscovery and what that means, what it means to recover what's lost, and then values. In terms of rediscovery, it's this notion that there are often things in our society, people in our society, history that we're comfortable with, but we haven't taken the time to revisit it.
Okay.
Dr. King's a good example of that. I think for most people, he remains frozen in a particular moment. People think about him in terms of the I Have a Dream speech, right. August of 1963, and he is reduced literally to a soundbite from that speech. When in reality, here's a man that wrote several books, gave hundreds of speeches, and we have this incredible body of work that he contributed to, and he grew over time. So Rediscovering King is also looking at his journey over time. How did he evolve as a leader? How did his thinking on issues of racial justice and equality evolve? One of the great examples of that I think we see in where Dr. King is at the end of his life with regard to the issue of poverty, when he writes meaningfully in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Mm-hmm. What good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. So that rediscovery is also about evolution. We all are on a journey. How do we evolve in the course of our own understanding of what equity and justice and relationship mean? Mm-hmm. The lost is interesting because some things we say are lost, but really what it is that we're really not anchored in the meaning of those things. One of the things that's interesting about that in our contemporary moment is that we talk about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King as solely a civil rights leader. But here was somebody who commented on things like technology and the advent of technology. One of my favorite speeches from him is from 1956, where he talks about how man has the capacity through technology to literally dwarf distance and place time in chains. Now, when he writes that, many of the modern accoutrements that we have today don't exist. So I think about it in this way. A couple of years ago, LeBron James was in the NBA Finals, and I was on a plane. I wasn't going to be able to see him play, and so I set my DVR. And literally, time was in chains. When I got home the following morning and I went down to my den and turned on the television, I could rewind time. That's an amazing technological advance that we should celebrate. And yet at the same time, are we using that technology, privileging it in ways that actually create peace, harmony, opportunity, health for the majority of people who share the planet with us? Mm-hmm. And so that's what's lost. So you have this capacity, but you lose the ability to think in the most humane ways about how to privilege that technology to benefit the broader society. And the last part is values. And one of the great things about being here with you in particular is that NDU has such an incredible value statement. and a vision and a mission that speaks to the ways in which it empowers young people to be leaders. And it has this language about meaningful engagement. And so in that sense, Dr. King's values are our values. And when we lean into that and understand that, it's very easy then to understand how we can think about, as we pursue our degrees, as we think about how we are relational with one another, how do we live that mission?
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that. I think there are two things that really stood out when you're saying that. One, I think, is this idea of seeing Dr. King's work beyond the moment. It's kind of his work being seen as a picture and not as a video, or not as in the fullness of his life, right? And I know you've written about that in your own book on Dr. King, and not getting caught in that static moment. But this other thing of applying, not just knowing, but it's doing. And I think that's really important. And then the specific do. Are we doing this? What I hear you saying is, are we doing this just to do it, to benefit maybe at times a few, or are we doing it to benefit the whole? And so what does that really mean?
It's so powerful, because I think in this moment in particular, it's understanding what Dr. King meant when he said, we can't escape our mutuality. We're caught up in the web, and what impacts one impacts everyone. So we have a duty and a responsibility to think responsibly, ethically about how things impact everyone else who we share space with. That is in terms of how we think about the environment. It's in terms of how we think about law and practice, how we think about the application of technology, how we think about how we even deal with each other in our everyday interactions. So it's this idea that when we think about it, and I love to tell my first year law students this, we talk about medicine as a practice, law as a practice, and that means that it's not perfect. Every day we have to get up and we have to do the work and the exercise of trying to be better every day. When we think about that, the work toward racial justice is a practice as well. And we have to be anchored in this idea that it's achievable, but only if we're willing to put in the work and be reflective in the ways that Dr. King suggested. Be part of that evolution, right? So it doesn't matter where you are today, it's where we wind up that matters the most.
Right. And I hear you saying it's just not just looking towards where we want to be, but actually working to get towards that space.
Actually being in that practice.
Being in that practice, excuse me. Yeah. So I'm going to continue this, and I really appreciate you sharing. One of the things that Dr. King talked about in his work and in his writings is this idea of service, of being of service and being a servant to a movement, to a cause, to a people. And I wonder if you could just kind of share your thoughts on Dr. King's notions around being of service.
He had this wonderful riff where he talked about everybody has the capacity to serve. And we often think about service in ways that are very cartoonish. So service means the biggest and greatest thing that you can do for the greatest number of people. But often the most meaningful service is service that's rendered by individuals who have capacity and are willing to share themselves in ways that are deeply meaningful. So we all have talents, gifts that we're able to utilize in ways that create beauty in our community, that make and help encourage a sense of belonging in our community. And King was very good about articulating that in ways that, the March on Washington isn't just about great speeches. It's about the wonderful music that's rendered by people like Mahalia Jackson. Organizing isn't just about who gives the speech. It's about the organizers who put in the work of making sure that people are mobilized and understand the principles that animate and activate the work that they do. Our dining services, we owe that to the men and women who show up and every day serve, right? Literally, not just in terms of what the food that's prepared, but the people who make sure that the waste is properly disposed of, so on and so forth. So it's a community of sharing, right? That ultimately benefits us in so many ways. But if we're not really dialed into the humanity of each person who contributes to that web, then we lose the idea that ultimately it's not the people that are at the top that actually drive this, but all of us who play a part. And really privileging and recognizing the humanity and the value of every person, and recognizing then that we all have a duty and responsibility to share those gifts and to serve our community. And that service isn't just in terms of what we do for work. So it's less about how you define yourself in terms of your profession, and more in terms of how you see yourself in relation to your community. What can I do today, tomorrow, the next day, for the rest of my life that actually contributes to those around me in ways that helps to create beauty, purpose, through an intentional practice of this idea of what King called the beloved community.
So I want to kind of stretch this out a little bit, because there's kind of a couple things you're saying. One, as we think about this I wonder how do we start to have people think about it, again, this idea of putting it to practice. And so I'll start there. I have another thought, but I just want to say, how do we go from just saying we need to be of service, and how do we actually start to put that into practice?
So you and I have talked about this, but one of my favorite pieces from Dr. King is when he's an undergraduate at Morehouse College, very young freshman, and he writes this piece in the Maroon Tiger where he is posing this question for young people in university in particular. And he says, I too often think that college men, and Morehouse was all male at that time, still is, but he says, have this misconception about the purpose of education. And he's asking this fundamental question, why are we doing this? And he says, some people believe that it's to get a career so they can be able to have a nice life and lord over the masses. So it's about privilege. And other people recognize it as a means to an end. And a true education should give us not only the skills to be able to do that work, but worthy subjects upon which to contemplate. So what are the important things in community that we should be thinking about? How do we maximize access to healthcare?
Right.
How do we ensure that those that are hungry have enough to eat? How do we think about childcare or water as a human right? Right. So these are kind of worthy subjects that if we were looking at it from the standpoint that we talk about the capacity to serve, then would radically alter the way that we think about education.
Yes.
Why are we here? What are we showing up for? It's because we want to figure out how to utilize those skills to benefit as many people as possible. But we also in that process have to recognize that we have biases that we have to overcome. So this is part of that practice too. Dr. King had to overcome them. We all kind of deal with these challenges. One of the things that was interesting about working on, Michael Long and I did an adaptation of Jonathan Ives' Pulitzer Prize winning book on Dr. King, King of Life. The thing I loved about working on that book is I've been a historian, my entire career. It was this rediscovery of King as a human being. We all have to go through this process, right? And so what I loved most about that is as we see King in practice, you see him dealing with his own biases, his own challenges, his own mental health, ways that we're not used to thinking about civil rights leaders. And I think it's a powerful lesson for young people in particular because these aren't superheroes. History is made by ordinary people who get up every day and in spite of recognizing their limitations are willing to do the work. And that's really what's powerful. The great Congressman John Lewis, who I had an opportunity to work with, put it this way, and I absolutely love this for young people. We love to tell young people you stand on the shoulders of giants. That's not true. You are the giants, but you have to learn from giants through the study of the past, through being vulnerable, by confronting your own limitations, how to be a giant so that you use that power in a way that creates and not destroys.
I really appreciate that. So the second piece that I want to connect as we're talking about service is I would say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they were born, they lived, they died relatively in the same community. We have more transient, the more transient nature of our community. So people come and go, and that sense of feeling community, I think may be a little bit more challenging now. So I say that in the sense of how do we think about service? How do we engage? How do we tackle these very challenging fundamental issues when we may feel like we're in these transient communities? Or even somebody says, my community becomes, we're in Grand Forks, North Dakota. So somebody say, my community is Grand Forks, or is it my 2 blocks of my neighborhood? How do I understand that? So I'm just wondering about that, this notion of maybe a community being a little bit more transient now than before.
I love that question because it's both. And in our moment more than ever, it requires us to be very careful in understanding that community means putting down devices and seeing the people that are in front of us, being very intentional about cultivating and leaning into what it means to share space with other people, human beings.
Okay.
As we look at this now through the lens of the existential threat of artificial intelligence, where it's easier than ever for people to be connected and yet disconnected. King put it this way, we have guided missiles but misguided men. And now we've got technology making it even easier for people to be misguided in the way that they utilize technology to hurt and harm others. So we really then have to think about developing the capacity for recognizing those authentic moments to connect with other human beings. And those are in small community, so friends, family, the associates, but it's also in greater community. Starts at the university. and then Grand Forks, right? And then the state of North Dakota, right? And then the nation, so on and so forth. And then globally, recognizing that, we also have a duty and responsibility to understand that what's happening halfway across the world may seemingly not be related to us. But ultimately, if at the end of the day, all these things are connected in ways that meaningfully connect us. So we should be concerned about the suffering of people half a world away, because the people half a world away have the same dreams, hopes, and aspirations as all of us. Peace, unity, opportunity, and we have to share those values in that value system. So in that sense, we connect this to service. If we're working in ways that allow us to think concretely about how to utilize our gifts in ways that create those opportunities, we're in community. But if we are not reflective in practice about what that means, because community also means taking that recycling and putting that in a recycling bin. Community also means understanding that if our views or in some way, if we created harm, that we want to address that in a way that privileges our shared humanity. Those are also practices of intentional community, and we need more people to embrace what it means to practice intentional community.
And in hearing you say that, I think it removes some of the barriers or some of the limits that people may put on themselves, that this person isn't my community, these people aren't a part of my community. And the way you talk about it in this reflection of King's work, it says that we are all in community. And so then the suffering of this person halfway across the world or 2 blocks down the street, they're all in our community. And at least that's what I hear you saying. And I think it normalizes the experience to really fight for the rights for those individuals or in all of our community.
And we sometimes become nearsighted, myopic in our work. So when we talked, and we were having our conversations back in November, you had shared something with me about working with students that I ended up applying a few weeks later. So community is also not just in terms of, the people that are in proximity. It's about also being open to learn, vulnerable from, understanding we don't have all the answers. Sometimes it's just in making connection with others who are doing similar work or are similarly engaged or concerned in the same way. We pick up nuggets, and that actually helps us be more authentic, more human in the spaces where we are working with and dealing with people and trying to create that same sense of harmony, community, unity, purpose, belonging. I love that because at the same time that was happening, I got an email a few weeks ago from a person I work with out in California. And she said, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, we worked together on this project and I'm still utilizing. So that's community too.
Right.
We never know. And I think this is very important for students, for young people, who you're going to touch.
Right.
You never know who you're going to inspire. And so we have to get up with that same sense of, and it's hard, I'm not saying it's easy, optimism and a desire to learn, a desire to give, but also a desire to receive, to teach, but to be taught. And in that sense of that flexibility, the way that Pedro Rupe described it in 1973, we become men and women for others. And I think that's beautiful.
Sure. I really appreciate that. So I wonder if you can discuss then how Dr. King's work has really had this kind of lasting change on the fight for human and civil rights.
It's interesting for me because I think, and I'll go back to Pedro Rupe to talk about Dr. King. In that same speech from Valencia, Spain, he said that ultimately everybody answers 3 questions. And those questions are, who am I, whose am I, and who am I called to be? And all great people answer those questions. So every great leader that we study, every significant person in history, but at the end of the day, we all answer those questions. And it's about accountability. When we think about Dr. King's life in particular, I think understanding the ways in which he answers those questions gives hope and inspiration to all of us. Because Mike King, not Martin Luther, the Reverend Dr., but Mike King, right? The young man who was concerned about injustice from a very young age.
Right.
The young
As he was born, right? Before
born.
his father, right. Yeah.
Who struggles, right, with ego, who struggles with his height, who struggles with mental health, who struggles in his relationship with women, right? So Dr. King has flaws, like we all do. I go back to John Lewis. What makes you a giant is overcoming fear. What makes you a giant is overcoming the natural inclination to say, who am I to be doing this, right? Or, I feel unworthy for this. It's overcoming that in a way that also recognizes with humility that ultimately what you're actually working toward is allowing everybody to be seen and heard and valued in ways that, create and enrich our idea of community. What I love about Dr. King's story, what I love about his life is, in the short time that he was on this planet, he left a legacy. It's a legacy of fighting for truth and equality, but it's also a legacy of what it means to be imperfect and yet to be working towards something that humbly privileges justice and equality. We all can do that. So when Dr. King says, everybody can be, he talks about the drum major instinct, and he says everybody wants to be the drum major, but everybody has the capacity to serve. At the end of the day, we all can do that. And sometimes in that sense, and he says it beautifully, the humblest is the peer, the more mighty, because service, when it's done right and when it's authentic, isn't about the what you're giving or what the value of the gift that you bring, but the gift itself.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you kind of weaving in these what may seemingly be complex ways of doing this work to the simplest form. And I say that respectfully and in the best way, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in the loftiness of, I can't do that thing. And what I hear you saying is, no, everybody, just what Dr. King said, everybody can serve.
Right.
And so, and it's not this glorified way, it's truly being a servant to the community. As you said, putting down whatever's blocking us from seeing that other person, and then being a servant to that person.
Right.
To their needs, to what's happening in our society.
And we live in the moment. So we've all had this experience that somebody will show or demonstrate an act of kindness in a moment, putting an umbrella over your head in a storm, and you were unprepared. And in that moment, that is the most wonderful thing that person could possibly have done for you. And then if we get addicted to that and understand that in a way that, well, wow, we all have those needs, then how can I elevate that in terms of what about the people that are hungry in my community? And if I can pay that forward by service being sometimes just in terms of volunteering at a soup kitchen, right? So that's kind of the lowest form. But then a deeper altruism that says, hey, look, it's not just that. It's not just that I want to be at the food kitchen. I have this opportunity to get this degree. How do I fight hunger? So my service at the food kitchen and showing up in community for people who are vulnerable and are suffering from food insecurity is now driving the way that I think about my career and my life and my calling, and I'm trying to wed those things in ways that I have the greatest impact, that those ripples of hope that I'm creating grow and get bigger and bigger. And I think, again, for young people in college in particular, kind of sorting out now, particularly in this moment where people are telling us artificial intelligence is going to take this job and this profession is in danger. There's a phenomenal book entitled Humility is the New Smart, another book called Robot Proof. Both books make compelling arguments that as we move forward and artificial intelligence is now taking some of this work away, those jobs that'll stand out, those careers that'll be most meaningful, are those that privilege humanity. None of us wants a robot therapist.
Right.
We want to sit in community with other people.
Yeah.
And so to do things that are authentically human now, it's not just about service. It's actually about being able to live in relation and community with others that privileges our own humanity, even as we're seeing the humanity of others.
Yeah. So now what you're talking about is that service and this recognition of humanity.
Absolutely.
And what that means. And I think about in Dr. King's last speech, his mountaintop speech, he really talked about that with the parable about the Good Samaritan. That's what comes to my mind as I hear you say that. And I'm wondering how you've thought about that parable and just, as we're talking about this, how might that also fit in this conversation?
I think about it a lot, and I think about it having been in Minneapolis in 2020 following the murder of George Floyd, going back to a speech that Dr. King had actually given in Minnesota in 1967, shortly before, a year before his death. And he talks about in that moment the community witnessing the violence and brutality visited on civil rights workers in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, and being so upset about what Eugene Bull Connor did to the protesters. And then a year later, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, assuming the work was done. It's like, well, they've got laws now, and so I don't have an obligation any longer. And so King says people were so overcome by the violence of Eugene Bull Connor, but they just wanted to get rid of that evil instead of getting rid of the systems
Right.
that were fundamentally, that helped to create Bull Connor in the first place, that Bull Connor served. In that sense, when I think about the Good Samaritan comes in and says, well, for this issue, right, I'm going to walk you home today, I'm going to dress your wounds, I'm going to pay your bill, right? But I don't expect to see you again. The greater calling is to recognize that I definitely want to see you again. The next time I want to see you in community, and I want to see us working together toward creating systems that are better, that create opportunity for everyone. And I think if Dr. King were alive today, right, with his 97th birthday, I think he'd be disappointed because he'd be looking at people perverting his words in ways that actually do the antithesis of creating that community, of privileging this idea that as a Good Samaritan, I've done this good work, right? But I am uncomfortable with dismantling the systems.
Right.
And when people hear dismantle, they immediately say, well, what do you mean? Oh, he says we can make them better. It's about the perfecting of institutions in order to create more opportunity. And it wasn't a destructive thing that King was talking about. It was actually something that could be creative and powerful and affirming and dignifying. But this generation can really take that work and carry that work forward.
Right, right. Yeah, I think in hearing that, I think Dr. King really was moving us away from kind of the singular notion of kind of bad or good or evil or whatever, in that it's more, as you're saying, the system. And how do we fundamentally change a system means we fundamentally change our experiences, our lived reality, and hopefully then the beloved community experiences that change too. If we just say it was, Bull Connor who did this thing, if Bull Connor is gone, then we must be okay, versus, to your point, have we addressed the system?
Right.
Has the system changed? When the system is the community, right? And so do we see a change there? Okay.
You're moving away from a thing-oriented society toward a person-oriented society. If we worship the things, then the people that create the things become those things that drive our metrics for success and for value in a larger society. And then when we slay dragons, right, or we think that we're slaying dragons, what we forget is that you're killing the babies in the nest instead of going after the larger beast, the triple threats of militarism that Dr. King talked about, materialism, that drive people to be disconnected and to ultimately chase things that don't affirm our humanity but deny it. So in that sense, I think, Dr. King's vision, and I always say this to people on King Day, it'd be great if we spent more time kind of interrogating more of what Dr. King wrote about in his books like Strength to Love or Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, less time focusing on his speeches, because in those speeches you're getting a snapshot of where he was at any given moment, but in the books, particularly that final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, you're getting a very thoughtful and committed person, practitioner for justice toward the close of his life, not knowing that the end is coming, reflecting on literally 9 years of service in the civil rights movement and coming to some really powerful conclusions about what it means to really be in and stay in the work. So in that mountaintop speech, when he says, and people think that King's prophetic for saying this, I've been to the mountaintop, I might not get there with you, that's less about him being prophetic. It's more about all of us recognizing that we have a finite time on this planet.
Right.
What do you do with it?
Right.
Because we all have the gift of time. We don't know when it runs out, but you got right now, you got the next 15 minutes, you got tomorrow, or at least you assume. What can you do with that time that you have? Right.
Yeah. And it is so important because that becomes this scale in which we kind of, the Egyptians really talk about we're weighing our soul and the work that we've done. Did you do good work? And so as I hear you, that's what I start to think about, right? And I think that is a very different measure than how much did you accumulate, how much wealth, how big is your house, but what was the impact that you made on the people around you? I'm going to push this a little bit if I can, and I'll just stay on this theme because you're starting to talk about his work, and one of the things he really was looking for was really how do we address kind of racism and discrimination. And so in his work and leading up until his untimely death, right, that Dr. King was looking at that. And it wasn't just that. We talked about the poor people's, or his poor people's movement. He talked about, violence not here, but just across the globe. He talked about engaging in war and what that means. But he talked about this idea of discrimination and racism. And so I'm wondering, how far we have come. And you even talked about George Floyd. So I'm wondering, how far have we come from his work in the 50s and the 60s to where we are now in terms of addressing, as a full society, what does it mean to address racism? What does it mean to address these forms of discrimination that we have seen plague our society?
It's a great question, and you and I talk about this a lot. I think what's interesting is that Dr. King would argue that what we don't want to do is deny some progress. It would be this idea that in the winter of our discontent, we would be wrong to argue that the work of those that have gone before has been for naught and nothing has changed. So there are visible signs of change in our society, but there's always the danger that those things can be rolled back. And King talked about this in one of my favorite sermons that he gives, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, where he uses the story, Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. And he says, Rip Van Winkle went up to the mountains to escape responsibility. He took his gun and his trusty dog, and he found a nice spot on the mountain. He falls asleep. We went to bed. King George is on the wall. And when he comes down 20 years later, George Washington's picture's on the wall. And he says the tragedy of Rip Van Winkle is not that he fell asleep, it's that he slept through a great revolution. And the danger for all of us is that in sleeping through a revolution, you miss that it requires alertness. It requires being awake. Now, today, that terminology has been bound up in all kinds of political infighting over what it means to be woke, but since when was being awakened to a danger a bad thing? And part of what Dr. King was arguing way back in 1959 in that speech was that people have to understand wake is at least in the way that he was talking about it in this particular sermon, is a synonym for alertness around the potential to lose ground. And so we all have to be alert that whatever gains have been made can be lost, and there's still work to be done. So staying vigilant is also about recognizing that some work you have to protect, some work you have to advance, all work you have to value, and recognize that you have to continue to push boundaries, understand ways that we can expand it, or otherwise it begins to recede. And what we want to do is prevent that recession, the losing of that ground.
And that becomes part of the struggle, this not receding but also, I think to your point, we have to acknowledge those victories along the way. So those gains that we've made, how do we make sure we don't lose those, and how do we continue to move forward in the work that we're doing?
Today is fundamentally different than it was in 1865.
Yes.
And we benefited from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They're under assault now. And so it's important for people to recognize that if we are going to talk about this process, this growth, Sandra Day O'Connor, the late Supreme Court Justice, was famous for saying democracy is a practice, right? And I love that because I think she's in conversation with Dr. King and with John Lewis and Ella Baker and other notable advocates for civil rights and equal justice, and recognizing that there's never a destination, there's never an end. It's just the work. Every generation has to commit to that work and in meaningful ways advance it, protect it, and keep that recession from happening.
And it allows us then, when Dr. King talks about this, the arc of justice, right? It allows us to see it in its, I don't want to say in its totality, but in its fullness. So it doesn't just seem like it's only a decade's worth of work, or even 2 decades worth of work. It's a lifetime, and it is inherited by the next generation, and it becomes their lifetime of work.
And we all have a responsibility. So people love to quote that as the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I like to say, but it's bent toward justice, because there are people who are doing the bending. And everybody has to jump up and grab and hold with all their might and continue to move in that direction, because the natural inclination is for it to move in the other direction, for people to choose comfort, for people to choose disengagement, for people to choose distance from those things that they find discomforting. In her book Caste, Isabel Wilkerson talks about this, and she says, racism is like an old house. If you've got mold in the attic or you've got water in the basement and you don't confront it, whatever's there is simply going to grow and fester until it gets worse. So you have to work up the courage to go into the basement to confront that thing. And then once you clean it out, you have to recognize it can come back. It'll creep back in. Or if it's not that, it'll be some other contagion or vermin that you have to deal with. And so that vigilance is about going into the basement and confronting the things that make us uncomfortable, largely because we recognize that that's part of protecting the house.
Yeah, yeah. So, how have you seen Dr. King's work? And I'll start by saying you've talked about the notion of Dr. King at times kind of being connected to, maybe at times singularly associated to one speech, right? This I have a dream speech. But I'm wondering, how is his work? How do you see his work, his fight for justice, for freedom, for rights? How is it being embraced by our society now?
I think Dr. King has been frozen in the way that there was a phenomenal and yet problematic obituary for Muhammad Ali after he passed away. And what the author of that in the New York Times, a guy named Robert Lipsey, wrote about Ali is that Ali was turned into a little bit of a secular saint. People forgot that Ali gave up his boxing title rather than fight in the Vietnam War because he believed it was fundamentally immoral. People forgot that Ali was a man who was really animated and motivated by conviction, and he thought racial justice was important. He felt that the United States wasn't living up to its values, and he spoke out. So he spoke truth to power. But years later, he was transformed into this kind of secular saint. Vincent Harding warns about the Santa Clausification of Dr. King in the same way, that we take these individuals and we declaw them, right, so they can't hurt us. And then we put them on a pedestal. And then we tell young people that the most important thing they said or did happened in this moment, and just remember that. The important thing about that lesson that Vincent Harding gives us and Robert Lipsey might be boiled down to a great cartoon that Pat Begley did in the Salt Lake City News about Ali. And he captured in a cartoon, in a political cartoon, what I think Lipsey was trying to accomplish in words. And what he simply said is that Ali was the greatest not because he was the champ. Ali was the greatest because he was always the challenger. We have to learn how to be challengers.
Yes.
King was phenomenal when he was challenging inequality. Ella Baker was so great as an organizer because she was always pushing the boundaries about how we challenge equality. Bayard Rustin, so many important people that we associate with the civil rights movement. And individuals who also had burdens to bear, like Pauli Murray and a Bayard Rustin, because as LGBTQ plus and Black, were fighting double, triple bonds of racism, sexism, homophobia, so on and so forth. So as challengers, they were saying, yeah, this thing, and then these other contagions, which are also robbing people of freedom, identity, opportunity. So for me, when I think about that in particular in our contemporary moment, we have a number of challenges we have yet to overcome. We need, all of us have to make that decision about how we are meaningfully involved and meaningfully engaged in that work of being challengers, like literally actively challengers.
Right. Yeah, and again, I think you take this very complex idea, and I think you're making it plain for us. I think you're making it not just palatable but understandable. Right? As I hear you say it, right? How do we engage? How do we continue to be challengers of these systems that at times can be oppressive and stifle our growth and development, our community's growth and development? And so as I hear you say it, I feel like I appreciate just laying it out in a way that allows us to see it in its fullness, and in many ways gives us a blueprint, because I think it is either, as you're saying, this snapshot, I have a dream, or it's so esoteric you won't understand it.
Right.
And I think then people give up and just say, well, I don't want to understand that. What's the thing I can understand? Oh, I have a dream that someday in the future, my children, And you're saying we have to go beyond that.
Right.
We have to see the fullness of this person. We have to understand the totality of what brought him to this point, and then understanding of what is the life lessons that helps us all move forward.
Right.
I hope I'm capturing.
You are. And I have no accountability if it's his dream. I can admire it. it exists over in this space.
Yeah.
I have no responsibility to bend that art.
That's right.
But if I'm a challenger, then I'm constantly looking at ways. I think about NDU in particular, the great space or technology program that you have with regard to aviation.
Sure.
And I think about a moment that'll be very familiar to a lot of people, less familiar to younger people, but they'll understand this is an example. 1986, there's a Space Shuttle Challenger. And the reason I love sharing the story is that in that moment, and this is long before the advent of what we would consider multiculturalism or diversity, if you look at the picture of the astronauts who made up the Space Shuttle Challenger mission, it is a beautiful portrait of American diversity. You've got Ellison Onizuka as Japanese American, first Japanese American in space who was on that ship, on that part of that mission. You've got Ronald McNair, the descendant of sharecroppers and slaves, who is on that mission. You've got two women, Judith Resnick, fourth woman, Ukrainian Jewish ancestry, who's on that mission. You get Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, because the Reagan administration wanted to democratize access to education. So you had all these people vying to go to space, and the Reagan administration chose a teacher because they were like, we want to make sure that all young people, we wanted this teacher to teach this lesson from space. I was in high school at that point. I was upset because I'm like, there's going to be a teacher in space, and I don't get the space lesson. So I think people were feeling that way.
Right.
And then you get these three gentlemen who are kind of dismissed as the three white guys, but two of them are descendants of immigrants. In fact, all of them were descendants of immigrants. So that's a powerful portrait of America.
Right.
When a challenger goes down, the assumption is that the pin that we put on it is in a tragedy. I don't think it was a tragedy. When Ronald Reagan is responding to that disaster, he goes on national television. It's the first time a sitting president mentions young people, children, school children. And he says, we witnessed this horrible thing, but I want you to understand, he says to the children of America, we don't hide our history. We don't cover things up. We do it all up in front and up and out in public. That's the way democracy is, and I wouldn't change it for a moment. What I love about that is that Reagan was essentially saying to them, what makes us different is not that we always do these things, but we aspire to them. And we need people to believe in that, because if we think about that mission, there's no way that some of the people who were on that ship should have believed a part of that mission that America actually lived up to those values, but they were there to bend the arc toward justice. Right. And when I look back on that in a moment that wasn't known for diversity, that wasn't when we were celebrating equity or inclusivity, and I say to people, we don't want to go back, they helped to pave the way for where we are now. And looking back at that history allows us to then understand the blueprint and the pathway forward, and recognizing that we don't want to abandon or betray those who've sacrificed to get us to this point. I'll tell you one other funny story about that. You go back to how the space program started, and John F. Kennedy in his moon speech at Rice University says, there is no prejudice or discrimination in outer space as of yet. Its dangers are hostile to us all. It's interesting because Kennedy was acknowledging if there's going to be racism and discrimination in space, we're going to be the ones that bring it there.
Right.
But there's this television program that comes out a few years later called Star Trek. You think about the original Star Trek crew.
Right.
It is an incredibly diverse, Gene Roddenberry had this incredibly diverse crew of Lieutenant Uhura, Mr. Sulu. If you put that picture of Star Trek 66 up against the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986, you can see that Roddenberry's vision actually becomes...
Yeah.
But one last wrinkle to this. Roddenberry didn't do that by accident. NBC had actually sent out a memo to all of its creators saying, we want to reflect that America is becoming more diverse. And we're going to greenlight projects that celebrate diversity in this way. And so he was responding to that. Nichelle Nichols, who plays Lieutenant Uhura, ends up becoming very popular on the show. She's considering leaving. She doesn't come because Leonard Nimoy advocates for her. She runs into Dr. King at a gala, and Dr. King says to her, Star Trek is the one program I allow my children to watch because it has this positive portrayal of Black Americans. She then parlays that into work with NASA, recruiting women and women and people of color into the program, which benefited Ronald McNair and others. Yeah. It's all, why do I tell that long story? That's the web of mutuality King was talking about. We never know, how does an actress influence technological innovation? How does a civil rights leader tie to this? How do corporate policies, because good people who are in those positions bend the arc toward justice. Yeah. Yeah. We all have to be challengers and bend the arc toward justice. Yeah.
And as I think about, as you say that, and you connected it to the aerospace program at UND, and I think about the opportunities that people have. And so this, if it makes sense here, hopefully it makes sense, but this idea of, do we see ourselves as how we are now, or what do we aspire to be? And I think that changes really a person's perspective in terms of saying, I can go to this aerospace, I can do aviation, I can do these things. Just as you're saying, this interconnected web of mutuality that I think people may not see here that is connected to here. So really having that experience and thinking about it as the way you're talking about it. Again, it's, and I say this respectfully, Dr. Williams, you're taking something that I think may be so complex, and you're really making it plain for us to say, this is how we move forward, step by step, inch by inch, foot by foot, and really, I can't say it definitely will be change, but I can be contributive to the change that I want to have happen.
Absolutely. And I've met some great UND students the last 2 days who kind of, including one gentleman in particular, who is an international student, but he's also in the reserves, and he's, doing all this incredible stuff. And you listen to him speak, and the hope and optimism that he expresses gives me hope and courage.
Right.
Because as challengers, I think we also witness and recognize that our future lays in the hands of young people who are going to be the stewards, not only of our democracy, but of our aspirations. And when you say that, that's why I love that Pedro Arrupe. Whose am I, and who am I called to be? Is all about not what you are, but what you aspire to, and never to give up on those aspirations. Yes. We're never going to be our ideal. But if we keep, and if all of us are kind of working toward this kind of aspirational goal of equality, opportunity, fraternity, brotherhood and sisterhood, we might get there, right? Or we'll be a little bit closer. And if that's the best we can hope for, the best that we can do, that'd be great. But I believe we probably can do a little bit better. So did Dr. King.
Right. And it's better than saying nothing will ever happen, so I won't do anything.
Exactly.
So making that. So I want to continue this a little bit more, and really thinking about this work. So how do we as a society, and you've been laying this out, but if somebody says, how do I carry on Dr. King's legacy? Right, because of that sense of loftiness, right? Somebody may say, there will never be another Dr. King, and I don't think we need another Dr. King. But if that person says, how do I carry on Dr. King's legacy? How do I fight for those individuals who are marginalized communities, those people who have been put to the peripheries of our society? What do you say in terms of what Dr. King's legacy can mean and do for them?
Love that question, because this is the 100th anniversary of Black History Month that we're coming up on. And Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, said, what this generation neither needs nor wants is the heroes or heroines of the past. We need people from this moment to step up and imbibe with the spirit and courage of those ancestors, carry the work forward. So we don't need another Dr. King. We don't need another Ella Baker or Bayard Rustin. What we need are people today who, through their own understanding of problems, their own commitment to justice, are working in ways that are helping to transform our social, political, economic, and cultural landscape. What I love about that is, if we think about it in that sense, Congressman John Lewis, I go back to, I had an opportunity to work with him on a couple of projects in New York City. And the last time I saw him was in 2019, so shortly before his death. And I knew at that point that I'd seen him, he was not long for this world because he was frail. And I remember him being, just vibrant, and you could just tell something was wrong. But we were in New York City together because he was working with young people at the New York Historical Society. He was promoting that March trilogy, which was a graphic novel, because he'd actually been activated by a comic book. So people don't know that story about him, but the Fellowship of Reconciliation, in order to ground young people in Southern communities about what was happening, put out a comic book because they said, in terms of literacy, this is something they can read. They were making it plain. They were making it accessible.
This connection.
Yes, which I love. And John Lewis read this and then wrote Dr. King a letter. And then Dr. King said, why don't you come on down and meet with me? And that's how John Lewis becomes the youngest member, youngest person who speaks at the March on Washington and gets involved with civil rights activities. So it's like on from there, that mentorship, that connection, that connectivity. But we're with these students, and obviously a few months later, we're into 2020. George Floyd is killed, and John Lewis writes his final letter to the American people, published posthumously just a few days after his death in the New York Times, July of 2020, entitled "Together We Can Redeem the Soul of America." And in it, he articulates what I call the Lewis Doctrine. And I believe that when people are looking for a blueprint, John Lewis laid it out for all of us. Mm-hmm. And essentially what he said, the kind of three big tenets of the Lewis Doctrine are: ordinary people with extraordinary vision have the power to redeem the soul of America. I like to tell young people in particular, ordinary people with extraordinary vision. So how do you develop that extraordinary vision? Well, he says you study the past, global history, national history, because the struggles that we are existing or and living in our contemporary moment aren't new, right? People at various continents and at various times have been through similar struggles, and we can learn from them. Number two, we never lose sight of our shared humanity, because the thing that ultimately makes us incapable of appreciating or working or having empathy is when we lose sight of that, and that we never allow our grievances to overcome our sense of empathy and compassion for others. So we put all those together, and I love this in particular. It wasn't that Dr. King was extraordinary. He was an ordinary person who, through extraordinary vision, was able to articulate the hopes and aspirations of a people denied opportunity. Wasn't it John Lewis was extraordinary? None of us are extraordinary. We develop that sense of extraordinary vision, and we can carry the work forward. As long as we're kind of studying the past and we're anchored in the sense of shared humanity and global in our approach. And the story I like to tell is I was doing coverage for Canadian broadcasting for George Floyd, and an Australian broadcast company reached out to me and said, "Dr. Williams, can you come on and you put what's happening in the United States in context for our viewership?" And so I went on to this Australian news program, which I had no idea it was going to be at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I get up at 3 and I go on. And then I give my spiel, and no sooner am I done that my social media is overcome by messages from Indigenous activists in Australia who are saying, and one of them stood out, a young woman who wrote me on LinkedIn, "Thank you for coming on and talking about the situation in the United States. But did you know, Dr. Williams, that 435 Indigenous people have died in police custody and encounters with police here in Australia? Your struggle is our struggle. And if you ever get the opportunity to come back on, could you please make that connection? Because everyone here is saying, look at the horrible things that are happening over there. And we're saying, this is an issue here too." I didn't know if I was going to get that opportunity, but after Derek Chauvin was found guilty, I got a call from ABC News Australia. Now this time I know it's at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I don't want to do it because I know it's at 4 o'clock in the morning, but I got a debt to pay. And so I go on, and a few minutes into the interview, 30 seconds into the interview, I say, "Well, this is a global issue, and I would remind your audience that 430." So let's be clear, I will never be on ABC Australia again. However, what was important for me in that moment was recognizing that opportunity to share with that community and to highlight that issue in the way that it had been shared with me was powerful. Right. That history that I learned, because then that set me on a journey. I had no idea. There's a reason why those Floyd protests resonated globally, is because anti-blackness is a problem globally. Right. And so when people are saying, it wasn't just that they were moved by what happened to George Floyd, they were seeing in the reflection of George Floyd the experience of their own communities and looking for a way to say, yeah, we want to overcome that kind of violence against people because they're othered. Right. So in that sense, when I think about that and people are like, well, how do I do this? The Lewis Doctrine, I think, gives us a way. Understanding ordinary people with extraordinary vision have the power to redeem the soul of America. We can study the past because that can help us to understand and develop that extraordinary vision. We recognize and really lean into our shared humanity. And last but not least, we proceed with courage, right? Recognizing that fear is natural, but to overcome that fear is really what makes you a giant, makes you a challenger. And the world desperately needs challengers.
It's tough to put words to what you're just saying. I really appreciate you sharing that. And so if I could kind of draw us to a close here, I'm wondering for you then, as you think about Dr. King's work, his legacy, how has that impacted you in the work that you're doing?
It's made me very mindful of, particularly at 55 years old, how precious time is. And it has really led me, particularly in the last 5 years, since I've been doing this work with the Racial Justice Initiative and community partners within the Twin Cities, to be more intentional and thoughtful about how I spend my time and who I spend it with and who I see as community. And this recognition that, it's not incumbent on any of us to do it all. It's incumbent on all of us to do something. And if we can inspire people to think in terms of the little ways that each of us chip away at indifference, chip away at violence, chip away at inequality, chip away at homophobia, chip away at sexism, we're then agents of the thing that we aspire to be. Sometimes that feels overwhelming. And I think anyone who said in this moment that that isn't overwhelming or doesn't seem daunting is disingenuous. At the same time, I have the power every day to make a decision toward doing something that I know is doing that process of chipping away. And in that sense, I think that what gives me hope and how that inspires me is to recognize that there were a whole lot of people that lived in moments that felt a lot like this. And they got up the next day and they did the work, and we celebrate them now. Dr. King becomes the person who's the stand-in for literally thousands of people who we could honor and celebrate in the same way for their everyday courage and commitment to justice and equality. We all can be the foot soldiers in that continuing war for decency.
Dr. Williams, I want to say thank you so much for not just lending your time, but for really sharing your insights with us and really bringing Dr. King's legacy, and not just bringing it to life, but allowing it to continue to live, and really how it has continued to impact us at times individually, but how it impacts us all as a community, and what does it mean for us to be in community and in service to each other. So I want to say thank you so much. We're really appreciative of having you be a part of this conversation and our celebration of Dr. King. So thank you.
My pleasure. Good seeing you.